Congratulations on joining us for the Gender in the Workplace conversation on communication bias. Rarely discussed but powerful, communication biases perpetuate gender inequality in many workplaces. For example, why is one person described as aggressive by some and assertive by others? And how do these biases impact their ability to deliver? We'll be discussing this topic amongst others with an aim to give you the tools and ideas on how you can improve your workplace. We'll be exploring this with our gender equity advocates, Abbey Hunt, Tanya Hosch, Dan Bognar, and Patrick Kidd. So let's begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we join today's meeting. For me, it's the Wathaurong people. Can I ask any of you to add yours into the chat? And on our behalf, I pay my respects to the elders past, present and future. And in the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country throughout Australia and their connections to the land, sea and community. And pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. And we extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. So why are we doing these webinars? Well, many of you know that we run the Gender Equity Awards for Australia, and we're lucky enough to learn about best practices. In fact, the judges are now busy assessing the nominations. So we do this to try and expose a lot of this discussion. Let me introduce you to our panellists and we'll get on to asking them some important questions. First of all, I'd like to introduce you to Abbey Hunt. Abbey is a leadership coach, psychologist, and the co-founder of Verizon and Data Drives Insights. She specialises in leadership and team capability in care, health, and the safety-sensitive industries. She's a mother and a stepmother of 5. It's the Brady Bunch at home. Abbey is committed to psychological safe workplaces. She spent over a decade providing critical incident response counselling to those affected by workplace deaths and suicide, which deepened her resolve to prevent such tragedies. Her recent achievements include publishing her first book, Excellence in Leadership, Culture and Safety in the Care Industry, 10 critical insights every care leader needs to know to deliver on their purpose. So welcome, Abbey. Lovely to have you here. Can you share with us briefly why you are so passionate about gender equity?
Yeah, thank you for having me, Lisa. Look, I'm really thrilled to be here, and gender equity is something that's I'm really passionate about. As I was saying earlier, this is probably the third kind of talk I've done in the last week around gender equity, and I believe that it really is one of the keys to actually developing human potential, so that we're actually able to heal the planet as well. So by creating equal voices, safe conversations to have with teams and with organisations, then the options for success are limitless.
Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. Our next panellist is Dan Bognar, who leads Hubspot's business across Japan and Asia Pac. In this role, he's responsible for driving growth and customer success across the region. In this capacity, leads Hubspot's key JPAC markets for Australia, Singapore and Japan. And in his past life has been associated with us as a finalist for the Gender Equity Awards and from DocuSign. So welcome, Dan. Can you share with us briefly why you're so passionate about gender equity?
Sure. Thanks, Lisa. And really appreciate you having me here and to be on such an esteemed panel. So look, I think it's something that I've been passionate about for a long time. I've always tried to play a role, particularly in empowering men and ensuring that men feel that they have responsibility to lean into gender equality and gender equity. From my perspective and based on the conversations I've had over the years, I've always seen this as a human issue. I don't know what that is, but always seen it as a human issue. And, I guess that the power that I've seen is when men and women have come together to be able to debate, to discuss, and particularly for men to really understand our unconscious bias and the role we play has been a really important contributor. So I've always tried to do my best to bring men into the discussion. I guess having a daughter has meant that this is a personal issue for me as well. So I'm thrilled to be here and be a part of it.
Wonderful, and we love having you along. Our next panelist is Tanya Hosch. She's the Executive General Manager of Inclusion and Social Policy at the AFL and the 2021 South Australian of the Year. She's had a really distinguished career in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander policy, advocacy and governance. And as the first Indigenous person and second woman in the AFL executive ranks, she oversees portfolios on the Indigenous issues, gender equality and diversity. Tanya co-chaired the Indigenous Advisory Group of NAB and contributed to the Recognise movement and played a key role in the Statement from the Heart. She also serves on several boards in her spare time and has been recognised for her influence and impact. Welcome, Tanya. We're delighted to have you with us. Can you share with us briefly why you're so passionate about gender equity?
Thanks, Lisa, and good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm coming in from Wurundjeri country today, but I live on Kaurna country in Adelaide. For me, I guess as a woman, as an Indigenous woman, it took me until I was in my mid-20s to really understand the intersection of experiences that I was having in relation to race and gender. And as a young woman, I started working in a feminist organisation in South Australia, where I really had my eyes opened up to the systemic discrimination that women faced, what gender inequity was doing to our society, and in fact, how it was really holding us all back. And so ever since I've had a better understanding, and I largely credit those amazing women in that organisation, and it was largely a volunteer-driven organisation, it opened my eyes to the opportunities that exist, but also the opportunities that were being denied, and injustice and discrimination are both things that drive me absolutely to spare. And I just wanted to be part of making a difference in that way. And I think gender has a very important canopy over society. It's one of the first things that you will recognise about a person when you meet them. And obviously there's a whole range of things that come along with that recognition, sometimes positive and sometimes not so much. And I really believe in equity and, identify as a feminist. So I totally believe in, working towards the equality of women in relation to social, economic and political measures.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that with us, Tanya. And my little quip earlier about Tanya's spare time, I mean, seriously, this lady does a huge amount of effort. So it's lovely to have you here. And our last panelist, by no means least, Patrick Kidd, or PK, is the CEO of the Future Skills organisation, which is backed by the Australian government to enhance Australia's digital workforce through industry-relevant training. With a 30-year military career in the British and Australian armies, culminating as a brigadier, Patrick commanded the Royal Tank Regiment in Afghanistan and Iraq, earning an OBE and an Order of Australia Medal. He also led the planning and delivery of the 2018 Invictus Games in Sydney. As CEO, he prioritises his priorities include empowering his team, focusing on impactful and achievable goals, and fostering shared responsibility with key stakeholders. And I can tell you in your remit, Patrick, the stakeholders are vast, and I'm sure it's a bit like herding cats. We're delighted to have you here. Can you share with us a little bit of why you're so passionate about gender equity?
Thanks, Lisa, and again, thank you for inviting me to be a part of this forum. I was saying earlier, just to the rest of the panel, that this has inspired me to have discussions that probably I hadn't had before. So I found it like a really useful experience, and even though I believe I'm committed, in thought, word, and deed to sort of this type of agenda, in some respects, you don't necessarily focus on these things in the way that you should. So I found it really useful to help drive me, I think, in the right direction. I'm in my heart, I'm a soldier. I'm 30 years a soldier, and soldiering is about being a part of a great team. And you can only do extraordinary things in difficult and dangerous environments when you have a great team that understands how to work together. But that team is broader than that. Actually, the team is the people that, the soldiers, sailors and airmen that sort of make up our defence forces, but it's also the families that sit behind them. And that may be female, they may be male, it doesn't matter. The point is that it's the whole that comes together that creates the strength. And so whenever I think about any job that I've ever done, be it the Invictus Games, the work I do today, the work I did yesterday, at the very heart of it is the idea of the team. And how do you empower the team and create a great team that is happy in the workplace, feels respected, and is able to do extraordinary things. And really, when you think about anybody and everybody, everyone has amazing potential, but you've got to help the potential come to the surface. And so unless you do this, you don't get to great teams. And so when I think about this particular issue, it's absolutely about how do we create the right environment for women to achieve their potential within the workplace, but and broader than that in community. But it's much more than that. This is about basically, being a basically good human being, which brings people together in the right way, whereby people feel respected and trust each other to enable them to do what it is they need to do. So this is such a fundamental part of how we operate and how we act. So that's why I believe in this. It's about the team. It's about respect for each other and the work that we do.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. So let's get on with it. Let's explore an example of communication bias. To set the scene, communication bias covers a number of different interactions that happen in business and society. These behaviours range from interruption patterns, speaking time, contributions in meetings, assumptions based on parental status, and encouragement bias, just to name a few. So what we plan to do is discuss each scenario and explore different ways our panellists would handle this, which will give you a bit of a roadmap on how you can potentially handle similar situations. So let's start with interruption patterns. Abbey, you've experienced this. Can you share your story, but not yet what you did about it?
Yeah, sure. So this one, it wasn't my particular example. I didn't experience it myself, but I was in the lunchroom a couple of weeks ago, and a colleague of mine came in and she said, I just chaired a meeting, and it's a rotating chair position each week. She said, I chaired the meeting and I was trying to get my point across, and it was so frustrating because everyone kept kind of interrupting me. But one of my male colleagues noticed that I was struggling to get my words across. So he summarised what I was going to say on my behalf. So that's the scenario.
All right. So Dan, what are your thoughts about this?
Yeah, look, I'm disappointed but not surprised in some respects. It always kind of blows my mind that here we are in 2024 and we're still discussing issues like this, which are just so simple. It's interesting hearing you, Abbey, because I also reached out to a number of people in my network just to get examples like this. And I think the example that you spoke about is very, very common. A number of females that I spoke to routinely shared with me that they feel speaked over, is that a word? Spoken over in meetings, that they feel that when they do speak up, their voice is not listened to, that they can make a point and that it's ignored, but if the man says almost verbatim the same point, that they get listened to. So it is all too common. And I think probably the other side of it is, I think the reality is for some women, they're so scarred by that they probably don't speak up in meetings. They really take a backward seat. So yeah, I'm frustrated to hear that it happened again so recently, but not too surprised, unfortunately.
And so, Dan, is there something that you would recommend could be done, both from your own perspective or from the woman's perspective? Yeah,
look, it's difficult because I think part of it has to do with change on both sides, I guess. I think on the female side, it's around pushing through that resistance and being more assertive. And I use that word with a little bit of hesitation because I don't mean that women by any stretch are unassertive, but I think you've got to kind of break through that and get your point across. I think equally men have to realize that they're putting females in a difficult situation and probably because of, this being such a prevalent issue, as we talked about, just being conscious that women are likely to take a backward seat. One of my team members actually shared with me something that really resonated with me. I hadn't come across it before, but it actually comes out of the multipliers. And the way it works is it's really the idea of using or at the front of the meeting saying, I have a certain amount of chips that I'm going to bring into the conversation, as in like a poker chips. And so what you do with that is you say, okay, well, I'm going to spend those chips based on points that I want to make. And equally, I need to spend those chips to bring females into the discussion. But that's kind of the extent of my chips. And so every time I'm going to make a point, the question I've got to, as a man, is I've got to think about is, am I spending it on me, or am I going to spend it on bringing somebody into the discussion? And I thought that was a really interesting way of looking at it, because I think that if we think about it as a quota of points that we're going to make in the discussion, how can we promote others to leverage that quota rather than spending it all on ourselves? So I quite like that.
Yeah, it's a nice idea. Tanya, what are your thoughts on this situation?
Yeah, like Abbey, it's an experience that I am sometimes familiar with, but I definitely often feel like I'm in the middle of one of those feminist cartoons that says, oh, that's an excellent idea, Tanya, perhaps a man would like to suggest it. It is very common. I think one of the things that I have realised is that it's important to be proactive about this and not wait for it to happen. And when I read Michelle Obama's book, and she talks about amplifying other women's voices, so I try to undertake at least one feminist act a day in my life. And one of the ways that the workplace makes that really easy for me to hit that target is to take the opportunity to amplify what a woman has said. So to really back her in very proactively, because sometimes what a woman's voice will get a raise very quickly in a conversation. And so I feel like backing in my female colleagues and making sure that I'm where I genuinely agree, that I add to their view and make sure that I'm actively putting my weight behind what they have said, I think is a really proactive way to help address those things where people feel like it might just be easier to speak on their behalf.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Tanya. And PK, what are your thoughts?
I mean, firstly, I think that this is a real issue, and I can think of a number of times when people have spoken to me about the sense that they have been overtalked or ignored. I think that the comment that talks about the great idea from the woman, but doesn't get reinforced until the man says it, I think is I've definitely heard that a few times before. And I'm reflecting on the conversation. I'm sort of thinking about the meetings that I chair, I suppose, and I suppose when I think about how I operate, I welcome the conversation because the conversation helps me get to clarity. And so sometimes there's a challenge there because I'll listen to different opinions. One might come from a woman, another might come from a man, and I won't necessarily form my view until a moment in time, but I really need that conversation and the discourse to help me understand where it is I need to go to. And so sometimes that way of chairing a meeting can be perhaps misinterpreted because actually you're not necessarily seen to be, backing in the comments and the worth of the comments that are made by individuals. And so I think there's a technique piece there in terms of just how do you ensure that you're getting the right types of conversations at the right time. I think there is, fundamental to all of this is this idea of trust, isn't there? In terms of, the perceptions that people have are either reinforced or challenged by the trust that you have as an organization. So if you can create a safe space for people to speak, then hopefully they're not going to the basement when they're thinking about how their comments are being received. And I think that's a really important principle that we have to try and put in place. Trust with the organisation and trust with the meeting that you have in place and the people that sit there. I think there is an individual responsibility in this, which is about, people have got to speak up. You've got to, everyone has to speak up. It doesn't matter where you come from. And so I think you've got to be confident enough to do that. But the leader has to make sure that they chair the meeting well to bring people in. There are techniques that we can use, so I think it doesn't just have to be sort of traditional voice and talking over each other. Just by good manners in a meeting, it helps people to communicate, some by writing, some by chatting within the chat, and some people sort of saying things, but there are lots of ways of getting your point across. And I think that's a part of the strategies that can be put in place. And I think the last point I'd make is sort of like, people have got to feel confident enough that if they see that type of behavior happening and it happens to them, they need to call it out, because so often it is unconscious. It wasn't meant that way, and they just need to see it. So, like, put up your hand and say what is on your mind. And I think that really helps people to understand how to do better in this space.
Some really good points there. Back to you, Abbey. What's your advice?
Well, leading on to what PK said, it's really important, yes, for someone to have a voice, and being able having the chair have the confidence to be able to call it out in the moment would be ideal. Being able to say, hang on a sec, feel like I'm getting talked over. Let me try and redo my points here. The challenge though is that if we look at psychological safety, which is the belief that I can actually speak up, it's safe for me to actually have a voice and have those conversations. What we know is that the average team psychological safety across the world is around 3 out of 10. So most of us prefer artificial harmony, which is that belief that, on the surface, we'll just bite our tongues because it's safer for me to do that. If we don't find our voices, then we're not going to get this balance right in terms of, the wonderful outcomes that can happen from having gender equity. We measure, so in the company that I work with, in both of the companies, we measure unconscious bias monthly. Because it's unconscious, because it's not visible, we have to measure it, and we've developed a tool to identify that. And it's great because then we kind of go, all right, this is really interesting. There's a segment of people in this group that are not feeling safe to speak up. Why? What's going on? And so we start to bring that to the surface. So for this particular colleague, it was a great opportunity to actually do that. The other thing I recommend is that, and what she did was she went back and had a conversation with the male colleague that actually spoke on her behalf and said, I appreciate you, summarising my points. I recognise that you noticed I was struggling there to get my voice across. Can I request next time that you actually help me create the space so that I can actually deliver that message myself? And so it's just a way of kind of, working together and not being too critical of one another as well. Yeah, we're all doing our best sometimes.
Absolutely. And probably the last thing that I just would add to this, there is a particular knack to being a chair in a meeting. And everybody who comes to a meeting has got their point to make. And usually many of them are so busy formulating their points that they're not listening to what's coming out. And so as a good chair will actually, follow on from a point and actually help land it so that it doesn't get overtaken by other people. And so, there's potentially chair training or, whoever's running the meeting training just to make sure that they can, have that strength in the meeting to land it. Anyway, lots of great ideas here. So hopefully people listening are taking down some little tips that they can use. So let's go on to another topic. Let's explore the assumptions that often happen around parental status. So PK, you had a particular story about this. Do you want to share that with us? I think you're on mute too.
Sorry, so give the story, but don't make any comment about the story. So just set the context. I'm going to give you two then. One which was when we wrote this and one which happened to me last week. So I think the first story is about long-term employee, not with us, but in the workforce for a long time. But that general sense that she has that there have been moments, a number of sliding door moments throughout her career where she believes that she's not been able to step through the door because of people's impressions about her ability to be able to commit to the workforce, commit to the workplace because of the children that she had and where she was at within her sort of parental journey. So that was, whether or not that, she herself would say, whether or not that was true or not, that's the overwhelming sense that she has as she reaches this sort of the last stage of her working career. That's the sense that she has, is that, she's missed opportunities because of how people have perceived where she was at. And the other one, which I think connects to this, is, of course, is that amazing moment in any employee's life when they sort of they are pregnant, they're about to sort of, and they're just announcing that within the workplace. And of course, that sort of absolute, as the employer, the sort of the shock of that happening because you're going to lose this amazing person for a period of time. And how do you respond to that? But also this amazing celebration of the fact that somebody is, starting this new chapter of their lives. It's sort of, it's an interesting tension, but and always I think for the employer, it is a bit of a shock, because you see these amazing people, you just think you just want to keep them there forever. But of course you can't do that, and everyone gets sort of better as time goes on. So I think those are like two stories.
Awesome. Okay, we've set the scene. Tanya, what are your thoughts on this situation?
Look, I think people's well-being is the sort of critical part, and I think it's been really great to have language now that speaks to people taking parental leave rather than maternity leave. I think that's been a really important distinction to make. Certainly in my workplace, we have a quite good system that allows fathers to take a certain amount of time of paid leave if their partner has a child as well, which is really, I guess, acknowledging the shared responsibility around parenting duties. And even though there's a physical responsibility on the woman to, bring this child into the world in a physical sense, and, the required time off, I think really challenging our assumptions and language about the way that people quite often judge. Sorry. Yes, sorry. That was my boss, the CEO of the AFL, just wanted to have a chat. The judgments that can come into play when someone chooses to be a mother at home, chooses to come back very quickly after having a child. I think we've got to challenge assumptions and also deal with the potential criticisms that can come their way. What I tend to do is be very celebratory around that kind of news, but also check in to say if there's anything that you might need as you're navigating this new part of your life, especially I think when you haven't done it before. Please let me know, and please let me know if you've got any concerns about what this means for you professionally, because I think sometimes we can assume that judgment's going to come. I am very fortunate to be in a workplace where I've seen a massive shift around those sorts of assumptions. But I know that my own experience when I had my daughter, I was absolutely paranoid about people assuming that when I'd given birth, I'd also had a lobotomy and I wasn't going to be able to contribute any further. As a result, I think I pushed myself back into work way too quickly in hindsight. And I like to share those stories quite openly because, really I think workforce flexibility is an established fact now that actually makes for better productivity and healthier people and therefore healthier workforces.
Yes, thank you for sharing that with us, Tanya. Dan, what are your thoughts about this?
Yeah, I have mixed thoughts on it. It's interesting. I kind of think about sort of two different scenarios here, Lisa. I mean, the scenario that we're speaking about, I think, is all too common. one of the female colleagues that I was speaking to as I was preparing for today's webinar shared a very similar story with me. She said that she'd returned from mat leave. She was kind of 8 months post maternity leave, and then a role came up in the company that she was working for at the time, and it was a more senior role, and she applied for it. And the only feedback that she got was that they wanted somebody that was, quote, more stable and reliable, was the quote. And when she checked in and said, well, what do you mean? What they confessed to was the fact that they'd made an assumption that she would likely go back for a second child, and therefore that was going to get in the way of this promotion. And that was astounding to me. And I think equally, I've been involved in situations where we've had both male and females on parental leave, where we've had to consider them for promotion or stock grants or what have you. And my view has always been, that should never get in the way of promotions or grants or whatever. But equally, I also had this other situation in the last couple of years where one of our female workers had come to me and said that he wanted to return to the workforce after 2 weeks of giving birth. And as somebody that as a father, and and my wife and I had 2 very difficult children, unfortunately, and a lot of challenges, I sort of also felt that I needed to provide some coaching to her to say, well, look, I understand where you're coming from, but equally, I think it's very difficult to sit here today and forecast, what that might look like. She'd never had a child before. And so it's a difficult one. I think sometimes we do play the role of psychologist, sometimes we play the role of manager, sometimes we play the role of kind of guidance counselor. I think though, as I think about the issue that PK described, I think that it's unfortunate. I think that too often we're making assumptions on behalf of people in terms of what they're capable of, and we've got to get beyond that. I think we've got to understand that this is something that is all too common. It's part of who we are as humans. It's going to continue to perpetuate, and it should never get in the way.
Yeah, I love that about promoting people and dealing with it whilst on parental leave. Just because they're not immediately here shouldn't stop anyone's upward trajectory. Abbey, what are your thoughts on handling this?
Yeah, I mean, look, a couple of words have come to my mind as you were talking, Dan, around guilt. So the feelings of guilt and fear of letting the team down or letting the organisation down. And those are feelings I know I've felt many times, and also with some of the colleagues that I've got as well have voiced that too. So even last night I was talking to a colleague who's on parental leave, and she said, I was due to come back, but I'm just not ready. I said, that's okay, because I don't want you coming back if you're feeling like you're doing it out of obligation or you're feeling like you're going to let the team down. I want you coming back because you feel like you're ready and it's the right thing for your family. Because if that's the case, then everyone wins, yeah? So in terms of PK's example, I think, yes, we wish that the unconscious bias around, parental being a parent is not there, but it is, and it's going to take time to kind of, get that changing. So I don't know, my response to that would be, what could people do? Well, I would suggest maybe get on the front foot. I don't know, and just kind of put that out there, in the interview process. I'm wondering if being a parent is going to be a deal breaker, or you've got concerns around that. And I just want to get on the front foot and explain to you how I manage my time and how I see this working, given I've got a family as well. Because sometimes if we raise it and we get it out in the open, it takes away some of the assumptions if it's just not talked about. That would be my recommendation.
It's interesting though, Abbey, because sorry, Lisa, if I could just interject for a moment, because I was thinking as you were talking about, I think there's always the financial aspects of it. There are some situations where people have to return to the workforce for good financial reasons, but this idea of guilt is a really strange one, because I guess to Tanya's point, what I've always tried to do in my discussions with people, male or female, is to kind of focus on that life change that they're going through, because it's monumental, right? And I think as humans, the ability for us to, procreate and give birth and raise children is such a human experience. How you would think about deprioritizing that because of a guilt to return to work, it just seems like a misalignment of priorities. And so it's interesting, as you kind of talked earlier, I was thinking like we got to come back to, I think, Tanya, you described celebrating it. I think that's probably the key to this. Like it is such a unique human experience.
Well, and I think to your point too, Dan, the more men that take parental leave too, the more it breaks down, who should feel guilty about this? Should the men feel guilty? Should the women feel guilty? Who's carrying the guilt? And if we can, make it just a human experience rather than a male-female one, maybe a better outcome. So, Patrick, do you want to wrap the topic up and share with us your suggestions and thoughts? You're on mute again.
Sorry, I've got the dog in the background, so he's contributing as well. I think great conversation. I think the point about language is so important, isn't it? Sort of, how do you celebrate? How do you recognise? How do you sort of create an environment that sort of people can sort of thrive in? And how far have we come in the last sort of 6 or 7 years? We must have made significant differences, I think, when we start to think about what is actually happening in the workplace and the examples that we can follow. At the end of the day, for me, this always comes down to people. Great people are great people, and they need to be supported to engage, in the workplace, in the community, in any way that they can. It's about how do you bring them in, and to do that, we need to be flexible. And my word, we can be flexible nowadays. And so I think we could make more of that and bring that together. Then maybe we empower our people to continue to contribute in a way that suits them, recognizing their personal as well as their professional sort of aspirations. And I think that's the exciting thing. It's sort of like, to the person who announced her sort of her child, sort of her future child sort of last week, an amazing employee. Really hope that we can keep her engaged with our work in some form or fashion as we go forward. That for us would be an absolute win.
And that's a really important point. We've actually had some really amazing stories of companies and how that engagement's gone, because to Dan's point earlier, you never know, do you, whether it's going to be an easy child or a difficult child until it arrives. So, whatever you can do often is how you create this ongoing relationship. And this one lady had stayed with her company for 25 years because of this relationship that happened during her pregnancy. So it's gold if you get it right. So let's go to another topic. Assuming authority. It often plays a part in diminishing how employees feel about themselves. Tanya, can you share with us your story?
Yes, I can. Thanks, Lisa. So this still happens to me, and I feel like the first time it happened was when I just sort of started to break through into more senior roles in my workplace. But it still happens to me today. In the nature of my work, I'm often moving around or travelling with quite high-profile men that are easily recognisable. And I often have the experience when I'm being introduced by my male colleague, I'm asked, are you his secretary? And that still happens to me today.
I shake my head. Patrick, what are your thoughts about this, and what do you think's motivating it, and what would you do about it?
So absolutely see it. I think it comes down to a couple of things almost. It's a very personal thing, I think. So first and foremost, I think, for the individual who's been impacted, I think they've got to be proud of who they are and what they do, and not be afraid to sort of explain the role that they play and what that role means. I think the other part of it then is around being reinforced by your colleagues. And so I think an important part of one of my roles is to explain where people sit and how important they are to the organisation, so that people are in no doubt as to what somebody does and the value that they have. So I think there's a behavioural piece. And then I think maybe there is something around, these hierarchies and job titles that we create. Like, we've got these awful titles, haven't we, for sort of jobs that demean really what these roles are. Like the secretary. What's a secretary? What's an executive assistant? It's complete nonsense. I mean, these people are absolutely fundamental to enabling an organisation to do what they need to do. So, maybe we should be a little bit more imaginative around how we devise structures and then describe job roles, so that people really are proud of, it does describe what they do, because those jobs are changing all of the time now. It's not what it used to be. So let's describe the jobs properly. Let's give people a sense of pride in the fact that they're doing proper jobs that stand on their own right, that they can be proud of, that they can then take with them from one industry to another, from one job role to another.
I love it. And as head of the Future Skills organisation, you're probably the person that could implement this for the rest of us. So
hurrah.
Exciting stuff. Abbey, what are your thoughts on this and what could be done about it?
I think, again, what PK said, and I'm sure Tanya does this very well, own your role and, have the charisma without ego, but have the charisma around, your position and what your skills are and what you brought. I also think a little bit of humour is sometimes useful, in a little subtle, gentle humour to kind of bring up the bias without shaming someone. Obviously, we don't want to do that. But, even questions back and go, oh, what makes you think I'm the secretary? And just being able to kind of pull it out and challenge the conversation a little bit more that way. I'm really thrilled by the younger generation, because I'm starting to see that bias really break down. And we challenge gender stereotypes all the time in our household. We'll often say, oh, so whose job is it to, cook and clean? And, the kids naturally just go, well, anyone's. So it's good, we're starting to break those things down. So I think the more that we start the education and actually bring these things up in conversation, the better. I think, just the final point there is stereotypes are unconscious, so we don't always know that we're doing it. And so by actually bringing it to the surface, that's a way of having the conversation. So the question I ask all teams is, how are you measuring bias? And that's a useful thing to just consider.
Yeah, absolutely. Dan, how would you handle this situation?
Yeah, look, I'm not sure I have much more to add. I thought Abbey and PK both handled it really well. I think that, my bet, Tanya, is that unconscious bias is coming from a man more often than it comes from a woman. And I think that's the sad reality of it. I think as men, we've got to own up and say, yeah, like that's not okay anymore. And it is our unconscious bias. I like the idea of calling people on it. And I love the idea of us being proud of who we are and the role we play. That certainly resonated with me.
All right, back to you, Tanya. Share with us how you did handle this situation.
Well, yes, it does typically happen with men raising that question, but some women do as well. And I must say, I do sense that some of this is also because I'm not white. And I like to sort of take a bit of a combination of what everyone's saying, I think, and taking the opportunity to have some subtle humour around it, just to call it out without it being a sort of threatening conversation. I always like to, add that I was once an executive assistant and I really loved doing that work. That the executive assistant that I have now is amazing and I wouldn't be able to be effective without her. And that there's nothing demeaning about what they're suggesting, but that it's probably worth considering why they thought that must be the role that I play when I'm actually, at the moment, the second longest serving executive at the Australian Football League.
Yeah, I wonder if there's an additional bias in the sporting realm as well, given that it's AFL, and whether there's a whole lot of assumptions around that too, perhaps.
Yeah, it'd be hard for me to say because honestly I've experienced it equally throughout my career and I've only been in sport for 8 years.
Yeah, right. Okay. Well, Exactly. Thank you very much for sharing that with us. And I think there's some really good tips in how to handle and just, to be a bit more thoughtful. We do have an unconscious bias quiz that we run every week to try and help us all discover our own unconscious biases, which I think, it's hard to become aware of. And that's on our gender equity site. So now on to our next topic. Let's explore the topic of performance reviews. It's a critical time where many employees feel most vulnerable. So Dan, you've got a story to share. Do you want to tell us the story, but not what you did about it till the end?
Sure. It's actually not my story, but it was a story that one of my female colleagues shared with me, and it really kind of stood out to me as something that I felt we could try and solve together. So the story goes that this particular individual, it's one of my direct reports, was in a situation where in a job that she had in the past, she used to work for a male country manager. And during the performance reviews that they had together, whenever she expressed her point of view or provided feedback, she was told that she was being too emotional. Was kind of the standard response. The way that she dealt with it is she tried to not use any emotive language. She tried to be very factual in the discussion, very, very data-driven in the discussion. But it really didn't make any impact at all. All of the performance reviews went the same way, which was, whenever she tried to provide her perspective, she was just faced with, yes, you're just being a little too emotional around it. She felt that it sort of extended beyond the performance reviews into, the day-to-day work life with this particular individual. It sort of got to the point that wherever she tried to provide feedback, it was always labelled as such. And so she very much withdrew in herself because she felt that it didn't really matter what she said or how she said it or how unemotional she was. She would always come up against it. So that was the scenario which really was shared with me.
Awesome. Thanks, Dan. What an interesting situation. Abbey, what are your thoughts on this?
Oh, I find that really sad. I think the reaction I have is it would most likely cause this repetitive pattern for her. I'm assuming where she kind of goes, there's no matter what I do, I'm not going to win here. And you're dealing with a really fixed view of someone. My thoughts around managing it would have to be if the person, this is hard, once the person's actually got that kind of loop in their mind that no matter what I say, it's not going to be heard, it's very difficult for someone to have a voice. If it's caught early, then the idea would be to actually be able to say, look, I feel like no matter what I say or however I present this information, it's not landing or it's being seen as too emotional. What would it look like if it wasn't emotional? Help me understand what you're saying in terms of, how I could be delivering this information differently. That might have a level of influence over the view or the stereotype. But as I said before, once a stereotype is a really concrete fixed view, it's very difficult to shift it and change it. And that's when, again, a lot of people that I work with will say, I've done what I can. I'm choosing to go somewhere else and try my luck down the road in a different organisation. The trap, though, is that sometimes that person will take that same view over to the next team that they work with. So it's a challenging battle, but having a voice and seeing if that works. If not, then you have to weigh it up in terms of your values for you.
So PK, how would you? Why do you think it's happening, and how would you handle it?
So much of this is about behaviours. And the individual behaviours that we have, our corporate behaviours, and how that then sort of like comes together to sort of have an impact on a person. I think that the real challenge is about, when you're in a business, businesses are focused upon sort of outcomes, and they don't value the behaviour piece. And so they're less concerned about sort of how you get there, more about where you get to. And so I think you then get to a conversation, I think, about what are the fundamental values that define you as an organisation. And values are sort of like an overused term. But actually, I think when used properly, they drive who you hire and how you performance manage your people. So we certainly just moved to a process now whereby we assess our people against their behaviours, which are determined by our values. And so we're looking all the time we take time to define the values, and then we now give people feedback around their performance against our values, because the only thing we can really control or influence directly as an organisation is people's behaviours. And being clear about what we think is reasonable versus what is not reasonable, and then calling it out, where people are not where they should be as an organisation. And I think it's super hard, but I think, that is a way of cutting through, I think, the very ruthless approach that companies have sometimes, which is a focus on the bottom line, which they have to have, obviously, because they run themselves as a business, but actually more about how you develop your human sort of resources, your capital, the people that really drive the business. So that's how we respond to it.
That's great process. Tanya, what are your thoughts on this?
I'm a very emotional person. I always have been, and certainly that criticism has been levelled at me many times. I think there's a really strong point in what Abby's saying about sometimes you have to cut your losses and look to be in a culture that is more, accepting or comfortable with people expressing emotion, although in this case it doesn't necessarily sound like that is necessarily what is happening. I think that there's a lot of cultural drivers in workplaces that indicate what's possible and what is not. And look, I work in sport, and the AFL is a huge organisation and it is a big business where a lot of passion and a lot of emotion comes into play on a very regular basis, at least every weekend. And so I feel that in where I am now, emotion is not something that is quite as foreign as it has been in some other workplaces, but I've actually also over the time have been able to have a conversation with people who have labelled me too emotional as something that is perhaps considered inappropriate or unprofessional. I would say that bringing your authentic self to work is really important, and there's we all put boundaries on how much we bring of ourselves to work, of course, but I think that being able to have a direct conversation for me where I just really want to seek to be understood about what's behind the emotion, and also sometimes that opens up a conversation about why the other person feels uncomfortable with the emotion. And I think if you can reach understandings with each other about those things, then it can be easier to actually have a much more powerful relationship going forward, where you both feel like there's a degree of empathy and understanding that means that all of your future dialogues are just so much more effective.
So to a certain extent, you'd actually face the person up and try and cut through that. Dan, over to you. What are your thoughts and how would you handle it?
Look, all really incredible feedback. Abby, your point around asking what would it look like for you if I was presenting it in a less emotional way, that really resonated with me. And I think also from Tanya and PK, the idea that emotions are a really positive thing in any workforce. We shouldn't have to turn off our emotions when we enter the workforce. The emotions can be a really powerful forcing point of alignment, of momentum, of confidence. Both those points really resonated with me. I appreciate the discussion.
Well, and maybe, if you got to a real stalemate, bringing a third person into the meeting to just get an unbiased opinion in there might be another discussion to have. But what a great discussion. I think everyone's learned a great deal about why communication bias continues in the workplace. It's not simple. but we've explored a number of simple roadmaps that can be implemented. For those of you who, like Dan and PK, want to support as a male ally and receive more information, we've got lots of tools and roadmaps on our website. And I'd like to get everyone to put their hands together with a huge thank you to our panelists for sharing their experiences and ideas. Thank you to Abbey Hunt, Dan Bognar, Patrick Kidd, and Tanya Hosch. Thank you all.
Thanks, Lisa.